I remember the day that the C word was first spoken in our household. I was in the middle of an intense season at work where we had constant deadlines, and at the time, I was in unrecognized burnout. I was sitting on the couch while my dad, who had just come from the ER, sat and told us that my mom had been diagnosed with cancer. My heart sank. I felt overwhelmed with 1,000 questions, and in the moment, I felt hopeless. When was the last time you felt this way? Maybe it wasn't a physical diagnosis. Perhaps it is your work situation where every day feels like a battle. Maybe your company just went through mass layoffs and you go into work one day and no longer have a job. Perhaps you're going through a difficult divorce. Part of being human is going through these challenging periods of life. In today's podcast, we are going to dive deep into practical strategies to help you navigate the storms of life. Welcome to Rekindle XM. I'm your host, Michelle, and with me are Brian and Masha. And in today's episode, we're going to explore 5 powerful emotion-based coping skills. These are designed to help you tackle professional and personal stress head-on, even in situations that are beyond your control. And just as a reminder, none of us are medical or mental health providers. We are 3 people who have faced and defeated professional and personal burnout. In our burnout recovery process, we each had to learn effective emotion-based coping methods, and that's what we're going to share with you today. So before we dive in, one final reminder, please help us reach 1 million hearts by subscribing and following Rekindle XM. All right, Brian and Masha, let's dive into our topic today. So first of all, why do we need emotion-based coping skills? Like, why can't we just use our problem-based coping skills where we just get rid of and eliminate the stressor or the problem? So what are your opinions on this?
Well,
Well,
we
if I
need that.
eliminated, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I like how you started. If I eliminated, what are you eliminating?
If I eliminated the stressor or the whatever was um, causing my emotional damage at the time, I'd probably end up in jail.
In jail?
Oh, ew. We don't
Tell
want to
us
go
more
there.
about
You
that.
can't just eliminate your stressors when it's other people causing it. So you can
Good
walk
point.
away
Good
from the
point.
stressor. Okay, the joke aside.
In all seriousness, what I was going to go into is that emotional coping methods are psychological and physiological need. It's not going to go anywhere. You have to do something with it. And when you manage stress in a intentional way, it will help address the challenges that are associated therewith. And that includes expressing your feelings, seeking support, engaging in activities that will bring you out of that mood into a positive mood. You're giving yourself that space and time to process things and then move on versus shoving it aside, problem solving, going to the next thing, never really dealing with this. And oh, that stress settled somewhere in the body or your mind.
So do you have examples of this where you have not used an emotion-based coping skill, or maybe you did, but it wasn't helpful? Masha, Brian?
Well, there's definitely a story about an impulsive coping method, which I'm going to talk about my ex for a moment. We He didn't get a promotion that he needed, that he was expecting for, and he walked into his boss's office and confronted him. He's like, dude, I was expecting a promotion today. What the heck? He didn't get it. He took his keys, threw it at the boss, and stormed out. So he quit on the spot. Well, that was a very poor decision. It was an impulsive decision, and it set up the whole relationship and family into more of a stress. So reactive versus impulsive, definitely recommended. You want to have some thought and intention behind that. Otherwise, you will put yourself in hot water and have that stressor keep on building just like a snowball down the hill until it, yeah, does some damage.
That's a good point, Masha, because in the professional environment, there are not very many times when you can say what you're actually thinking in the moment. And part of that is because our impulsive nature, we want to say something we shouldn't. But there is that professionalism where you are supposed to keep the peace, you're supposed to kind of keep the atmosphere as calm as possible. So in that moment, usually your first thought is not the right one.
That's why it's important to talk about the coping methods to help us not be impulsive.
Yes. Stop, take a deep breath, then react in a positive way.
Hmm. Well, and I think another situation, so in the professional world, there are obviously situations that come up every day. But on the personal side, there are also a lot of situations. And um, at the time of recording this podcast, all three of us are actually going through some difficult situations with loved ones whose health is failing. And the reality is, there's nothing you can do about that particular physical condition. Um, you reach the limits of what medicine can do. You've reached the limits of often of what you personally can do. So sometimes the only way to deal with it is figuring out what helps you manage your emotions during that time. How do you guys feel about that?
I think it's an
Yeah.
excellent call out because you cannot fix other people's problems. And this is the empath's problem, right? People come to you and they want to vent, but some people take it a step further and they try to solve their problems and bring them out of the rut. That's not always the case. And this is something that we actually learned in therapy with my daughter. And what we need to do when people come to us, we need to ask permission. Like, do you just want to vent and for me to listen? Do you need me to counsel you to give you some ways out that you can solve this problem? Or do you want me to solve this problem for you? Oftentimes, we jump right into solving problems versus just being there for someone and letting them talk through it and solve those problems on their own.
Yes, and I also think that um, we tend to bury our emotions. Men are especially bad at that. I know that you ladies do it as well, but I think it's kind of a cultural distinction that men are not supposed to be expressive in their emotions. And so we have to bury those emotions. And part of that is a safety mechanism so you can deal with the situation. But there also comes a time where you have to face those emotions. And um, if there's a situation where you're constantly having to suppress those emotions with somebody that you know, eventually there's going to be a large passive aggressive moment where you just completely unload everything that's been bugging you. And that's not a helpful way to deal with those emotions. And Michelle's laughing because she likes to do that to me occasionally, but I used to do that too. So I can't just say it's ladies only. So
Yeah, there was one particular episode where I was so mad. I didn't throw anything at Brian, but I did throw shoes in the house. So Brian's like, go for a walk. I obviously needed some kind of emotional coping to get past that.
I'm also an
yeah.
expert of burying my feelings because at the moment when you're going through stressors, they're not important because you have to deal with the stressor in a positive reactive way. But later you have to come back to it and deal with it. And I'm not good at that either. So I do have an accountability buddy, and I gave my daughter permission to call me out and just gently, not don't poke the bear and throw the bomb, just be gentle and poke around and see what's going on, see if I can recognize it. And over the last couple of weeks, she's been, Mom, what's wrong? What do you mean? Nothing's wrong. Everything's great. No, Mom, something's wrong. I can see it on your face. Nope, everything's great. Come on, Mom, something is there. I just know it because I'm you and you're me. And I'm like, Okay, you're right. So I start like going through the inventory of all the crap that happened over the last 2 weeks. I'm like, oh, wow, the list is pretty hefty. I did not deal with a single one of those things. And that is a gateway also for us to self reflect and really deal with those issues. Another indicator, besides somebody telling you, because we're not great listeners, especially when we're in that space of potentially exploding on someone or neglecting or running away because we're just tucked away that stressor and we don't want to deal with it, is being aware and recognizing how nice are you to your dogs? How cluttered is your house? When's the last time you emptied the dishwasher? So little things like that that you are uh, doing to keep your life going. If you begin to slack on them, well, there could be something you're not dealing with, and that's my experience. When I begin, when my dishwasher is too full and I hate that chore. I do not like unloading the dishwasher. I will load it all day long. I want it in a very specific way, but goodness, taking the dishes out and putting them away, I will avoid it for weeks if I have to. That's my daughter's chores, by the way. So, yes, there's multiple things that you can do to be aware, and I need both.
Yeah, Masha, that's just interesting that there are some signals and signs that you are not coping with your emotions. Um, I'm curious, what types of things have we all ignored? I know that Brian told me for years that I was working too hard. I was taking too much responsibility for my job. Just like you, Masha, I didn't listen. I just continued. But I did notice these emotions and I would just kind of stuff them away. So you notice this feeling of, oh my goodness, I am so overwhelmed. If somebody puts one other thing onto my plate, I'm just going to lose it. Or you find yourself yelling at your husband, your kids, your dog, whoever. So you mentioned that. Um, and a lot of times that is the fact that we are not dealing with those emotions of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. I can absolutely attest, and Brian can attest, that I would have these big outbursts then because eventually they do come up. Yes, that's all he's going to
Have a
say. Oh,
comment.
you're being way too nice. Brian's like, yeah, I still have to live with you after the podcast. I can't be too mean.
I'm not commenting any more than that. We kind of already beat that horse dead.
All right. So let's talk about, we all do have some kind of coping method to deal with the emotions that come in life. Let's talk about healthy versus unhealthy. And Masha, you've mentioned one. Throwing your keys at your boss or the keys at the boss is probably not a great one. What other types of coping methods are there that are unhealthy? So let's talk about that first. What do folks do to deal with emotions in ways that are perhaps not the most healthy for long term? They may help in the short term.
Brian, you can go first.
Well, thank you. Um, I think the longer you get into a stressful situation or long-term stress and burnout, the less capacity you have to deal with emotions, and the more likely you're going to use an unhelpful coping method. Um, I know at work I had a hard time. My facial expressions generally say everything that I'm feeling, and between my facial expressions and my wasn't necessarily quick to anger, but I would get agitated very easily. And I think you start to lose control of your emotions when you start hitting a long-term burnout. And that definitely felt like the case to me. Plus, if you're not dealing with those emotions, then you're just angry all the time. So those are unhelpful. And I definitely started using unhelpful coping methods to deal with some of that because food was one of my big ones, and I started drinking quite a bit as well.
Excellent call out. And experience and observations, what people do, they numb and neglect. So numbing and neglecting, definitely unhelpful coping method, and substance abuse, alcohol, binge watching Netflix. It may be great, but oh my goodness, what does it really do to your body? Maybe one show's okay, but if you just keep going day in, day out with no end in sight, that is not good for your psyche or your body. So recognizing those is super important. And other forms of neglect, when you get too overwhelmed and things just and you don't recognize it and your scope just gets bigger and bigger and one more thing and one more thing. Well, finally, when one more thing does get added to your plate, people walk away. And this is what happens to me too. So when I was the yes woman, yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do it. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm saying yes, but there's no way I can make this happen. So what happens when you're way overwhelmed? You take a pause and you don't attain to anything, even the things that you need. So keeping track of your calendar, you stop keeping track of your calendar. You start missing deadlines. You stop missing meetings and luncheons and your friends and those helpful environments that you do need. You begin to say no to them too. You start neglecting your faith. And if you have a relationship with God, by the end of the stress, you're like, who God is? I don't remember. So reconnecting is definitely important, but recognizing when that scope creep happens, you got to stop it. Otherwise, you will fall into numbing and neglect or
Yeah.
impulsion.
And as all three of us found out, because we've all been through burnout and recovered, eventually you do pay a price. So sometimes that can stop you in your tracks where you are laid out in bed, end up in the ER, or you just come to this crisis point in your life where I'm just done. I think you talked about that, Masha. So um,
Well, I think you're missing the
there,
other side of that too, though,
oh,
because
yeah,
it's
go
not
ahead.
just if it's unrecognized and you keep going in that direction and you're using substances to cope, there comes a point where you become addicted, and then
Mhm.
that's a whole another level of thing to deal with on top of that burnout. So
Mhm.
there's two paths to destruction, and they both end up the same.
Yeah, and I
So
think the same thing applies if you're going through other stressors and difficult situations that, turning to those unhealthy coping methods, eventually, if you go down that route, you can end up, like you said, with another problem then that you've got to try to figure out. So, all right. So this is kind of a serious topic and um, hard to talk about, hard to think about, but the reality is we do have the ability to turn those emotions into a place of peace and calm again, but it requires some specific tools and coping methods. So um, we're going to move on now to that to 5 emotion-based coping methods that you can start using today to deal with stress or difficult situations. So we're going to start with one that perhaps we don't think about, but journaling or writing about your experiences, what you're feeling. So, Masha and Brian, have you ever used a method of writing to help you? And what does that do for you?
when I was a teenager in high school, I had this sweet little spot overseeing it's a cliff in the valley and then the Rocky Mountains that you could see. So I would take my diary and I would write poems. I would go there every weekend, watch the sunset, and I would just write. And some of those writings are really interesting. I did publish some poems, and of course, they're lost. I'll never find them. But over the years, I stopped because life gotten too busy until my third burnout, where I really emerged back in it and realized, oh my goodness, writing is the way I cope. It's the way to bring those emotions up to the surface. If I don't write, my mind goes too fast. I'll never catch them. Well, what was I feeling? Whoa, was that disappointment? Ooh, that's what disappointment feels like. Okay, I learned a new emotion. We're never too old to learn emotions. All we have to do is pause and acknowledge the feeling and then ask the questions. If you ask the questions of yourself, they will come. Well, what is this feeling? Where did it come from? And once you're aware, you can cope with that in a proactive way, even if it's writing or talking it through.
And Masha, just a quick question. Did that writing and journaling, did that actually help you to clarify and identify what those emotions were?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would sit there and meditate. I'm like, I don't know this feeling. What is this feeling? It radiates from deep in my gut. and it just makes me feel nauseous. Well, I'm not physically sick. It's something making me sick. What is it? And going through that process of the 5 whys exercise, Michelle, that you taught us was eye-opening. Well, why do I feel this way? And it comes to find out something happened in an email 3 weeks ago. I'm like, oh, I've been holding on to it for 3 weeks. I'm like, oh, that makes sense why I've been feeling off for 3 weeks.
Um, yes, in my 20s, I wrote a lot of poems. Mostly it was trying to figure out my relationship with God, but it was also my time to converse with God on things that were going on with me at the time. And that was a very hopeful time period. I actually wrote a lot, but during this last period of time, journaling was, I journaled a little bit, and I have off and on when I get to a point where I just really need to put down what's going on. I don't journal a lot, but I do journal. Writing this book was the biggest healing point for me, that we have coming out. So putting my thoughts into where I came from and how I got to where I was, and just covering all of that, that was probably one of the largest emotional copings that I've done. Because when you start at the beginning and you start trying to catalog where you started, where it came from, and how you got to where you were, you start to see everything laid out on how you got there. And you're like, oh, 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 and
Yes.
and then you can start to recover.
Yeah, I like that. And Masha, yeah, I'm sure you have a lot to say on this too, but I like the fact that somehow laying it out once we recognize, oh, this is what I'm dealing with, that helps us then to take the next steps. Brian, you just helped me recently. So I am not a poet. I have done some journaling and I've done some over the past couple years with recovery from burnout. But wow, like poetry feels so alien to me when it comes to writing. But Brian helped me to write a poem for my mom. Expressing my feelings for her as her health is quickly declining, and it was so helpful for me to have a way to express that. So writing is powerful. Um, any final comments, Basha? I think you were about to say something.
Yes, yes. I think the power of journaling goes underestimated for many, whether it's fear of writing your thoughts down and facing them, or fear that somebody else may violate your privacy and trust and read your private journal. So, all those things aside, you can manage and deal with those. The benefits of that is personally, I'll talk about that. When I was going through divorce and other failed relationships, I recognized something only through journaling, that I was picking the wrong relationships. I was picking toxic relationships that were not serving me well at all. And I was able to recognize that and root it to my childhood trauma. And then once I became aware of that, that is when I started working and healing my heart to overcome that. But if it wasn't for journaling and recognizing that pattern, oh, oh my goodness, where did I see this pattern? I've seen that pattern in my biological father and how he
Mm.
had his relationship with his mother, or with my mother and his mother. And I adopted that as my norm, as a false belief. And subconsciously, I would welcome those toxic relationships without being aware and giving those poor relationships to enter. So lots of power behind that.
Yeah, wow, Masha, it does help us to realize things that we would otherwise miss. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's move on to the next one. And I'm going to just title this one the 3 M's. So we have journaling, now we have the 3 M's. What I mean by that is mindfulness, meditation, and mindset. They are three slightly different concepts, but they often go together. So, Masha, Brian, where have you learned or practiced the three of these, and how have you found if they have meshed together? How have you used these 3 M's together?
I don't know if that I've used all three of them together at the same time, but I think over time you tend to use one or the other. Um, During the time that we took that sabbatical, the biggest thing I probably did was meditation, because I had to start letting those emotions come through. I couldn't, you know, I was tired, I was overwhelmed. I had no desire to do anything. Um, some people would probably say it was depression. I don't know whether I'm choosing to admit that or not. But it was only when I started letting those emotions work through me and starting to face them that I started to be able to move past all of this. Um, and that took a while. It took 8 or 9 months for me to deal with the full range of emotions that my burnout had left me with. So um, don't expect that any type of journey through large long-term stress or like traumatic events to end quickly. You have to be willing to take the time and be mindful that it will take time and give yourself patience. And despite Masha saying that binging on Netflix was bad, um, it maybe not have been the healthiest way for me to cope, but it was definitely one of the ways that I chose to cope that time because it gave me a chance to just not have to think. And sometimes you need that time too. So,
Oh, 100% agree. I still do it. I mean, I am on Suits right now and I can't wait for that thing to be over. I'm like, okay, come on now. It's got to come to an end at some point. But once you
yeah,
start binging, you can't stop until it's over. But to your point, yes, I agree. It could be helpful when you want to shut your mind off. But when you just sit on that couch and you just have an episode after episode, and you have that inner voice telling you, oh, shut it off, last one. And then you keep ignoring it. And the next one and the next one come. The next thing you know, it's 2 a.m. It's like, I just did something awful. I completely screwed up my circadian cycle for the rest of the week, and I'm going to struggle at work. So, helpful,
there's a
unhelpful, you got to
difference.
balance it out.
I
There's some
don't have an
mindfulness
inner
that comes
voice. I
into
have an
account.
outer voice.
Oh, that's
I don't
me.
have an inner, yeah, I don't have an inner voice. I have an outer voice.
Brian,
Yeah,
it's
my
time to go
daughter
to
finds
bed.
me
Turn it
asleep
off.
on a couch half the time. Turn it off. Yes, it's okay. You have the power to turn it off.
Anyway,
Oh. All right. So we actually just hit on mindfulness there and how that is important to know where we're at and to be able to regulate, our current actions and emotions. So, um, yeah, that comes with practice. And I've taken some mindfulness courses. It's not something that happens immediately because the truth is most of us aren't aware. I actually just read some statistics, and it was just in passing, so I didn't go deep and find out, oh, well, who did this survey? How good of a survey was it? But what they essentially said is that most people think they are mindful and self aware, and like 80% are not. So we all have some work to do there of being self aware of our emotions and our actions and what we are doing at the current moment. So, how about
There was a
mindset?
season.
Oh, go ahead.
What I was going to comment there is mindfulness, meditation, and mindset. I think there's seasons with those for me in the spring and summer and fall. I manage well and I can do that well. I have my spot. I'm there every day and it discharges all the negativity, refuels me with all the energy that I need. But during the winters, when I don't have that space, it is hard. And it's hard for most of us because we're limited to doing the things that we like if we're not too much into the winter sports. So seasons come and they go, and you need a different coping strategy to deal with the three M's in the winter time.
Masha, I'm going to get you some snowshoes. That is
No.
a no. You don't like the cold? All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on. I guess the one thing I would say about the three M's mindfulness, meditation, mindset they take some practice. You don't typically change your mindset overnight. It takes time. We've done a lot of that over the last year as we've all recovered and talked through our experiences. So be patient with yourself. All right. Let's
and you
move
have to
on
keep working
to
on it.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It is not a switch to flip as much as we would all love to just completely switch our mindsets and the way that our minds work, it takes time. There's science behind that. So, good call out, Brian. That will take some time. All right, let's move on to breathing. And this is something obviously that we're doing right now. We do all the time. But what do we mean by breathing to cope with emotion? emotional based.
Wow. Breathing is our greatest ally and our worst enemy. We get in our habits where we don't breathe with intention and good quality. Our breaths can be shallow and frequent, or we can hold our breath even when we're dealing with a stressor. And this is something that I've caught myself doing, but I wasn't really aware of that until somebody told me, breathe. I'm like, oh, I'm holding my breath. And then I started observing myself when stressors come up, I hold my breath. This is the weirdest thing. You'd think we'd be an experts who've been doing this our whole lives, but babies do it perfect. There is a breathing technique that I was taught when I was dealing with my burnout. And that helps with anxiety. It will help you with relaxation and really grounding yourself. It's called the 4-7-8 breathing technique. So you inhale your breath in 4 seconds, and then you hold it for 7 seconds, and then you take 8 seconds to exhale it. So 4 intake, 7 hold, 8 exhale. You do it 3 times in a row, 3 times a day. So when you first wake up, during lunchtime, and during the evening time when you try to unwind. It's an amazing technique in a sense that you breathe with intention and you realize how when you hold that breath, you kind of collect all your stress in this ball. And then when you exhale it slowly, it leaves. And with 3 breaths, you can reduce your physical body tension and reset your mind and be well again. Incredible exercise, highly recommend it. It's done with much intention. And it seems like, oh, I have to exercise and breathe. Duh. I mean, that's weird. But there are so many benefits to it, and you physically feel your tension leave your body.
Yeah,
And
we've done a lot of
in a
that between the
similar
three of us.
in a similar way, I saw Andrew Huberman YouTube thing where he was doing a full breath in and then another breath, and then he lets it out as long as it needs to. And I've been trying that, and that actually within 1 to 3 breaths, it does make a significant difference in your level of stress. It does kind of help you calm down.
Mhm.
The message is there are many different techniques. Find the one that you
Yes.
like.
Yes.
Yes.
And there is science behind that. And as Brian mentioned, the Huberman podcast. So he's a neuroscientist and he gives great advice, but he explained the science behind our breaths. If our inhale is longer than our exhale, we are actually increasing our heart rate. And that goes along with that stress response versus doing it the other way. So, Masha, you called out 4-7-8, where your inhale is shorter, your exhale is longer, actually slows down our heart rate and helps return us to that less stress state. So really important. There are about 1,000 variations. So again, find the one that works for you.
So when you go to the doctor's office to get your BP checked and your first one's out of whack, just do those 3 breaths. You'll pass.
I've been doing that for years, Masha. I totally do that because so many people get white coat syndrome. It's well documented. Like this is a documented response that many of us have as soon as we go into the doctor's office. So, yep, great advice. All right, guys, let's move on. Let's talk about our fourth emotion based coping tool, and that is sensory tools. So, literally, what we're talking about is using our senses to calm us down. And again, there's thousands of ways to do this, but Brian and Masha, what are some sensory tools that you like to use?
I think
So
Michelle
in
should go
therapy, I
first.
learned a
Oh,
tool.
Brian,
Oh,
go for it.
okay. I'll hold my
We're going to
tongue.
battle it out. Brian, go.
No, I said I think Michelle should go first.
Yes. Okay, Michelle, hear it.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes. So most of the people who've listened to this know that I'm a big walker out in nature. And for me, looking around so that the eyesight, looking around and seeing the trees and the nature is part of it. The smells, when I go to the mountains, that pine smell, for whatever reason, that is emotionally calming for me. So I love that smell. It's like fresh air. So that's a big one. And then, of course, listening, hearing the birds, hearing the chipmunks, whatever's going on is also part of that. So I would say I get most of mine out in nature. I don't usually taste things though. So, Masha,
Incredible.
go.
I can relate. I love being outside too, even if I'm just sitting on my back patio and just observing the nature. I have a green belt outside of my house, and that is my serenity, my peaceful place. In therapy, however, I learned a technique, and it's incredible. It's called 5 4 3 2 1. So, first, what are the 5 things that you can see? So, when you're stressed out, take a look outside of the screen of what you're looking at and look for 5 objects near and far that you can see. Next is 4 things you can feel. So, what do you feel around you? If you have a stress ball, if you have different textures, really do better um, coping method if you have different texture and physical qualities that are different from one another. And then three things you can hear. What are the sounds that are around you? Static and electrical sound doesn't count, so try beyond it. Is that birds? Is that music that is playing in the house? Things like that. Two are the things that you can smell. And you may know this about me. I've gotten big in aromatherapy, is having pleasant scents around you. It does help me breathe better and ground me quite a bit. And one thing you can taste. So, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. It'll take about 5 minutes, and you'll have a different mindset once you're done with that grounding exercise.
And what does that do? Does it just distract your mind from what you were thinking about? Like what do you find when you actually do that exercise?
It helps you with anxiety, and I've noticed it helps with depression too. So when you get that email and you get annoyed, you have some sort of emotion that you just want to get over quick. That is the method to leap out of anxiety, out of that state of into state of ah.
And I'm gonna jump back in, and then Brian, you can go. But it's interesting because each one of the senses have the ability to do that. So there's a website called 24-Hour Sound Machine, and it gives you a variety of white noise, of nature sounds, of just about anything you can want actually. So music, sound by itself can help. Like these can all help by themselves, but I love that particular technique, Masha, because one, it's fairly quick and it really does help you to gain that different perspective. So thanks for sharing that. All right, Brian, you're on the spot. What about your sensory tools?
Well, now that you brought up music, I realized that I do tend to listen to music a lot, especially if I need to focus or um, there was a time period where I'd actually fall asleep to music because it would help soothe me enough to be able to fall asleep during times where I was kind of stressed out. So music does play a big part in being able to do that, but um, I like being out in nature. I don't think I focus so much on sensory tools as much as I do other methods. So
I know we don't agree with Mozart, but I listen to Mozart when I work, and I find it impossible to be in any other mood than feeling joy and focus when I listen to it. Makes you want to
Oh,
leap out of your seat.
I love Mozart too, Masha. In fact, I wanted to name our RV. I actually wanted to name it Amadeus. And Brian was like, no, that's dumb. But we happened to have an Allegro red, and Allegro was Mozart's favorite tempo. He likes upbeat, fast music for his time. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm also a big supporter of Mozart. Brian's like, no thanks.
I didn't say I
Find what
didn't
works
like
for you.
Mozart. I just don't like classical music in general. There are still classical music songs that I enjoy, but it is not my style of music.
We're
Yeah.
gonna convert you.
No, you're not. Her mother
No.
and I have had
The
this discussion over a long period of time.
Yeah. Again, it's find what works for you and use that. All right, guys. Last coping method we're going to talk about today is support. So, by support, we mean people. And this comes in a variety of forms. So, Masha and Brian, what are your experiences with getting support to help you with emotional coping?
For me, support of my community and going to my parish every weekend, it does wonders. One, the service is amazing. It just speaks to your soul. And the community afterwards, when we do suppers, we reconnect and we have that sense of community where you're all like-minded and use similar coping strategies. Another coping method for me with that is conversations with my friends. And I have this relationship with my friend I met in college that when we connect, we sometimes play phone tag and we'll go play phone tag for about 2 weeks. We just can't connect. She's busy, I'm busy, but we take the time to keep trying. And then when we finally catch each other, it's quite a conversation. So in 2018, when my daughter was going through some health issues and it was a month, I was not able to connect with her for a month. And we played phone tag every day for 30 days. And finally, she leaves me this voice message and she says, if you don't answer my next call, I am driving over there. Something's off. Because we are that support system for each other. And finally, it was late and I called her and she picked up and she's like, what the heck is going on? And I told her all of the grief and trauma we've been going through for 30 days. And it was really stressful on mind and body and spirit. But the way I was telling her, I told her everything that happened from start to finish. I made it a fun story. I was just unloading. I was crying. I was laughing. I was feeling her in. And she said, Masha, I'm so sorry. I'm going to laugh the way you're saying it. I know it's not funny, but I have to laugh. I'm like, oh, please do laugh because like this is just too much for any person to handle of bam to bam to bam of crap happening to you for a month. It was extreme. But what unloaded me, what recharged me was finally connecting with her and sharing my burdens and feeling so much lighter after that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have, um, I guess Michelle and I are our support group at the moment, and Masha, when we get the occasion where we're talking about this stuff while we're outside of the podcast. But um, there was times where I definitely had a friend that I could talk to and go over stuff with, and they helped me out a lot. I don't know how much guys tend to use this method. I know I don't have a whole big support group that I can go to and unload. Um, there are times where I do kind of miss, having the another male friend that I could talk to, because trying to talk to your wife is one thing and they can kind of understand, but they're not of the same persuasion. So it's there's always a little bit of a disconnect. I do think it's important, but I think guys struggle on this part just because it's hard for us to find somebody that we trust enough to have those conversations.
Yeah, to your point, our small but mighty fellowship group that we have together is my closest group. We see each other so much and we talk about everything that's happening in our life. And what I do appreciate, you just call it out, like Masha, something's going on there. How long have you been neglecting that piece? I'm like, oh yes. And this is the great accountability to have that conversation and allow that accountability for self responsibility is really important. One other thing that I suggest, Brian, and I know you guys travel a lot and it's hard to find this place, but I found a lot of that piece in a Bible study group. So I do have a Bible study group that I go to. We don't meet as often as I want to, but when we do, we just can't stop chatting. And before we actually get to the Bible, it's like
Yes,
two
but that's
hours.
the
And then
difference between men's Bible study groups and women's Bible study groups. There's a connection and you do grow a bond, but it's never the same as what you're making it out to be. So
You
there's
know,
a major
it's
difference between how guys go about support groups and talking to friends versus women.
I think that is a good call out, and I think that that is hard for men because Brian, you've mentioned that like it's hard to get past that surface conversation and really go in depth. Um, so I think it does require more effort for, and that's not necessarily just men because I'm not the most I don't tend to share as emotionally either unless I'm really close to someone, which, Masha, you've obviously gotten way more than most people.
I've been
Um,
married to her for
you
almost
know.
18 years, and she still doesn't share that much, so it must take a lot of emotional comfort to get her to do
The
that.
work wife, I got special privileges.
That's right. Yep. So I think this can be a hard thing depending on your personality, but there are still options. So one is depending on your personality, it may be that you just have a couple friends that you are really close to. Or, here's where you could consider a therapist or a coach. So there are some other avenues where if it's not you have the friends that you already have, if it's not your family, there are other options that you can look into. I do think that this is harder for some personalities than others, but here's the one thing I would say is if you're in a difficult time of life, for whatever reason, many of us tend to withdraw from our friends and our family when we actually need to lean in, assuming that they're supportive and can, listen. So I know that's not always the case, but we have to kind of fight that natural instinct to distance ourselves, and we have to just take that, be courageous enough to have those conversations. That's something I'm still working on. All right, guys, great discussion. Again, those 5 coping methods are journaling, the 3 M's of mindfulness, meditation, mindset, breathing, sensory tools, and support. So I'd like to stop and just invite our listeners to share below in the comments what are your favorite emotion based coping skills, or what is it that maybe you want to learn, particularly if you're going through one of these difficult patches in life, which we are all going to hit. All right, well, thanks for listening today. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to subscribe and leave a positive review. Join us next week as we kickstart your journey towards reclaiming joy. We are going to talk about what it takes to move us out of situations in life or work that are stealing our joy and move towards your true desires and purpose in life.